During a week-long stretch in the fall of 1982, 7 people in the Chicago area died from Tylenol that was laced with cyanide, and these deaths came to be known as the Tylenol Murders. These murders rocked the nation, but they were never solved, and they're considered one of the greatest mysteries of modern times. The official story has always been that some lone nut maniac was poisoning bottles of Tylenol randomly with no real motive and then suddenly stopped for no real reason. But this lone nut madman official story is honestly pretty absurd, and there is way more to the story than that. On September 29th, 1982, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman died of a heart attack shortly after taking an extra strength Tylenol. In the next few days, 6 more people in the Chicago area died after taking Tylenol, and testing revealed that cyanide had been mixed among the capsules in these bottles. Investigators said the bottles hadn't been tampered with during the distribution process because the cyanide would have dissolved the capsules after a few days. Instead, they believe someone was opening Tylenol bottles on store shelves, lacing them with cyanide, then putting them back on the shelf, where anyone could have purchased them. This idea that some sort of psycho killer was poisoning bottles of Tylenol at random set off total hysteria.
If you have any Tylenol headache products in your home, do not take them.
Time magazine warned about the maniac in our midst. Newsweek wrote of a psychopath with a diabolical idea for anonymous murder. Illinois Governor James Thompson told residents that we have a madman out there, and hundreds of FBI agents and Chicago police were assigned to find this madman. Drugstores and supermarkets pulled Tylenol from the shelves, and Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol, recalled 31 million bottles of Tylenol nationwide to test them. The case was seemingly solved when a ransom note demanding $1 million to stop the poisonings was sent to Johnson & Johnson. The note was traced to a man named James Lewis. He had a very strange background, including stays in a mental asylum and an arrest for murder, but he and his wife were in New York at the time of the poisoning, so he was ruled out. This paranoia went on for weeks, and the manhunt for the psychopath Tylenol killer was the #1 news story for the rest of 1982. And then something pretty strange happened. The hysteria surrounding the Tylenol murders just kind of vanished. After being the talk of the nation for months, the whole issue just disappeared. Tylenol relaunched with new tamper resistant packaging, the media quit covering the story, and the investigation went cold. Still to this day, the official narrative is that the murders were the work of some lone unidentified madman who was poisoning bottles of Tylenol for no apparent reason, then stopped for no apparent reason, and this lone madman was never caught. Now, quote unquote lone nut madmen have been linked to many infamous crimes over the years, and if you look into these crimes, there's typically way more to the story. Strange backgrounds, coincidences, and things that just don't make sense. And that is definitely true for the Tylenol murders. There are so many mysteries surrounding this case, and one of the biggest involves Tylenol's main competitor, a pretty evil company by the name of Bayer. Now, to me, the most interesting mystery surrounding the Tylenol murders is why were only bottles of Tylenol poisoned? If there was indeed some lone madman who wanted to randomly kill people with cyanide, he could have poisoned anything. Other medication could have just as easily been poisoned, or not even medication. Cyanide could have been sprinkled onto fruit in a grocery store or concealed in bottles of ketchup, salad dressing, anything at all on shelves. So, why did this supposed madman only poison Tylenol? And this is where one of the more intriguing explanations for the Tylenol murders comes into play. When the deaths began, it was speculated that these Tylenol poisonings could be a type of corporate sabotage against Tylenol. Basically, one of Tylenol's competitors was trying to ruin the company by sabotaging the product's reputation. Newsweek magazine was one of the first to mention corporate sabotage. They speculated that an overzealous competitor, bloodied by Tylenol in the battle for market share, had the most to gain from the Tylenol scare. Other newspaper articles right after the deaths raised this possibility too. But then the media started focusing on the crazy lone nut madman, and the idea that a Tylenol competitor was behind the poisonings got ignored. But there's a lot about this explanation that makes sense. In 1982, extra strength Tylenol was still a new product. It had only been around 6 years, but it absolutely dominated the billion-dollar painkiller market. It was called one of the most successful consumer products in history, and in less than a decade, the product had helped Tylenol grow bigger than their closest 4 competitors combined. The company that Tylenol had unseated was Bayer, who had been the number one painkiller for decades but had shrunk to only 7% of the market share due to Tylenol's success. Bayer was an offshoot of German conglomerate IG Farben, and IG Farben was a nasty, nasty company.
During World War II, a company called IG Farben was in charge of making the deadly chemicals used in Nazi concentration camps. As a reward for their help, the IG Farben was allowed to conduct experiments on Jewish prisoners and test out their chemicals and their medications on these people. And once the war ended and the executives from IG Farben were charged with war crimes, they went and formed a new company called Bayer, a company that we're all familiar with today.
So, yes, IG Farben's war crimes in World War II were absolutely heinous. During what was dubbed the IG Farben trial after the war, multiple executives were sentenced to prison and Farben was ordered to break up into several smaller companies. Bayer was one of these companies, but Bayer basically became IG Farben Jr. because they simply rehired many Farben executives and board members. For example, IG Farben's Fritz Termeer was sentenced to 7 years in prison after the war for his role in quote-unquote mass murder and enslavement. After he'd served his sentence, he became chairman of the board of directors of Bayer. Beyond their war crimes, Bayer has done a ton of evil things over the years. One of their worst abuses happened in 1983 when it was found that Bayer's Cutter Pharmaceutical division was selling plasma injections that were contaminated with the HIV virus. Bayer was banned from selling the injections in the USA, so they simply started selling the product in foreign countries, knowing full well that their product was causing AIDS in patients. Thousands ended up dying of AIDS from these injections, and this is considered one of the most horrific things that any corporation has ever done. There are a ton of other examples of Bayer's evilness. It is a plain nasty company, and another interesting note about Bayer is that right before the Tylenol murders occurred, Bayer was in some serious trouble. In mid-1982, studies linked Bayer's aspirin to Reye's syndrome in children, a disease that claimed around 1,000 lives a year. The U.S. Surgeon General advised parents to avoid aspirin-based painkillers like Bayer for children, and there was a push to require Bayer to have a warning about Reye's syndrome on their packaging. Since Tylenol was a non-aspirin pain reliever, it wouldn't have the warning, which could have had a catastrophic effect on Bayer. After all, why would anyone buy a painkiller with a warning label about Reye's syndrome on it instead of the one without a warning label? Then in September 1982, the Tylenol murders happened and stole the headlines. The stories about Bayer and Reye's syndrome got buried and forgotten. Tylenol became the big boogeyman, and sales plummeted so badly that many believed it would end the company for good. And the timing is so interesting how this happened right as Bayer was receiving a ton of negative publicity about Reye's syndrome and losing massive market share to Tylenol. It would also explain why only Tylenol was targeted by this supposed killer. And if this seems hard to believe a company would be behind sabotage like this, it shouldn't. This book, Spooks from 1978, is one of the more incredible books out there. It documents a worldwide network of secret agents, spies, and mercenaries that almost all major corporations hire to perform sabotage, wiretaps, even assassination against their competitors. These contract agents are often former FBI, CIA, and military personnel who earn significantly more as private contractors who are hired out to whoever pays them. And often the highest bidders are major corporations from McDonald's to Marriott to Chase to every Fortune 500 company. In the Tylenol versus Bayer battle, billions of dollars were at stake, and Tylenol was trouncing Bayer. After the Tylenol murders, people at the time really thought that Tylenol would never recover. Bayer had a horrible history of abuses, and they were facing a ton of negative publicity in mid-1982 from the Reye's syndrome investigation. If they really did hire someone to poison a few Tylenol bottles to distract from that investigation and ruin their main competitor, it nearly worked perfectly. Now, even if you do choose to believe the official story that a crazed lone madman was behind the Tylenol murders, there are so many questions, holes, and things that are just plain bizarre about the official story. We're going to have a part 2 follow-up to this video where we'll look at the just absurdity of the official story and the two men who were the main suspects in the killings. Both suspects have backgrounds that are almost too strange to be believed. So definitely subscribe so you're notified when part 2 is out, and we'll see you soon.